All right, let's get back to some football. Speaking of weird and slightly wonderful, Cleveland, the latest going on there with the Browns. They're reportedly expected to release star receiver Odell Beckham Jr. today. This was only Odell's third season in Cleveland, but plenty of evidence put on tape during those 3 years that the connection between Odell and Baker has not worked, isn't going to work, will no longer work now or seemingly ever. So, Nick, who will be better off after this split, this divorce, Baker or Odell?
Well, in the short term, I think it will absolutely unequivocally be Odell. Assuming he does get to pick his team, he's going to pick a team with a good quarterback, and he's going to look awesome. And you can go ahead and throw this in the life isn't fair bucket, because Odell clearly has not, I would argue, handled forcing his way out of Cleveland in the most professional manner imaginable. He did it at a really bad time. He did it kind of passive-aggressively, I would imagine, with his dad and with LeBron kind of doing it for him so his hands can stay clean, even though they're not really clean. But I think it's going to work out great for him, Broussard. And I've used the comp many times. Randy, who I think is the second greatest receiver ever, was dogging it in Oakland.
Agreed.
Just wanted out of there. Got out of there and ended up having a resurgence that led to the greatest season a wide receiver has ever had, or maybe the second greatest. Rice did have 20 touchdowns in a strike-shortened year, but one of the two greatest wide receiver seasons ever. So listen, it's not always fair, but I think that the Browns are going to miss the playoffs this year. I think the Browns are in real trouble, and I think the Browns have a real tough decision coming up with Baker. And I think Odell's going to end up with a Pro Bowl or MVP caliber quarterback and be making plays in the postseason. So I think it's going to work out much better for Odell, at least in the short term.
Okay, you may be right in the short term, and I'll get back to this, but let me address Baker first. I think it's Baker Mayfield overall, because Baker Mayfield's future, long term, I believe, is brighter. He's still got his own team. Even if the Browns don't sign him to the long-term contract after this season, they'll franchise him. He'll still have 3 years, 2-3 years to still prove himself. And he has proven that he can win without OBJ. And he's got the great running game, the great offensive line, and still some good receivers. So I still think long-term it's Baker. I do agree with you that OBJ could have some moments. If he goes to the Chiefs, even as the third option, and they turn things around, get deep in the playoffs, he's making a touchdown here or there. Like, it'll look good for him. If he goes to a team that wins a Super Bowl and catches a couple touchdowns in the playoffs, makes a few big plays, kind of like Antonio Brown last year with Tampa Bay, that will look good for him. He'll be redeemed. But, and I don't hate your Randy Moss comp, Nick, but there are a lot of differences. Like, I don't think Odell will ever get back to being that top 5 receiver in the league. What we saw his first 3 years in New York with the Giants. And here's why I differentiate between him and Randy Moss. Number one, Randy Moss has some things going for him that OBJ doesn't. Randy Moss was 6'4", just unique, with 4.2 speed. World-class speed.
Of course.
Odell's 5'11", ran a 4.4 at his best. Does he still run a 4.4? I don't know. Okay, so he didn't have those just freakish things about him that Randy Moss did. Secondly, Randy Moss, even in his down years, was not injured. He was just, as you said, dogging it. Too. Whereas OBJ has had significant physical injuries that he might not be, probably isn't what he was physically. Thirdly, Randy Moss went to the GOAT. I mean, he went to Tom Brady, all right? OBJ, and he became the first option in New England. If OBJ goes to a guy I've said, and I'm sure you believe has GOAT potential in Pat Mahomes, he's going to be the third option. And so if he goes to
Rodgers,
Green Bay,
he's the second option.
He's the second. Right, yeah, at best.
That's right. That's true.
I think I don't hate your comp, but I would bet against it if I had to, because I just think there are things that Randy had whilst that OBJ doesn't.
Yeah, I personally like the comp. Like, you go to Foxborough, you start catching touchdowns, you start winning. So I think the Foxborough move that you're advocating for, Nick, makes a lot of sense. So I appreciate that. Here's the reason why I think it's Odell too, but it's not necessarily about Odell. It's about Baker. Baker's still hurt. The idea that we've sort of like left this narrative train leave the station and we're not talking about it anymore. Baker, we've talked about Baker shutting it down. So I don't know what we're expecting from Baker this weekend, but it's not like all of a sudden just because Odell's father, retweeted a video and LeBron jumped on social media to say free Odell, that was some move that healed Baker's labrum and fractured shoulder. I don't think Baker's season at all, Nick, is going to look like what we want it to look like simply because of injuries.
But I want to talk about another part of Baker long term, and I'm going to once again throw a question at Wilds. I gave him no prep for, and he has no idea is coming. It was the second time in 3 segments. Wilds, what was, in your opinion, the single worst thing Danny Ainge did when running the Celtics that still to this day you think has ramifications?
Wow.
Nothing.
Well, I'm sorry, Jenna. There is one thing that gets deep into my heart, and I think if you're being set up right, I think that trading the heart and soul of that team, Isaiah Thomas, once he played injured in the playoffs, and then just shipping him out for Kyrie and be like, that's business, that's the way it goes. I think it has cursed the Celtics.
That's right. Okay, that's right. So here's why the audience saying, why is that being brought up? Because sometimes individual moves have long-term ramifications. And I do wonder this, because I think the rest of the NFL, I think the top flight players in the NFL still think Odell has the ability to be a star. What #1 receiver is going to next offseason after, say, I want to go play in Cleveland? Oh, it worked out so great for Odell Beckham Jr. It's going to work out great for me. I think that this failing the way it did, in addition to the fact Dusty's been on this all year, the Browns run more 3 tight end sets with just 1 receiver on the field than any team in the league by an enormous margin. Second most has done it 50 plays. The Browns have done it 128 plays. So stylistically, the offense is not necessarily conducive to a wide receiver getting huge numbers. They had a star. He was miserable there, didn't get his numbers, forced his way out. Broussard mentioned it. Last year, his biggest game of the year, 3 touchdowns. Only 1 was a pass from the quarterback. The other was a pass from the wide receiver, and the other was a run on a double reverse. So I do think that the Browns, now Donovan Peoples-Jones is a nice player. I like him. They drafted him. They obviously still have Jarvis. But I think that this going south, Broussard, with Odell is going to impact their ability to sign a wide receiver, a top-flight wide receiver, if that's something Andrew Berry and management there were planning to do in the future. I think it's much harder now.
It's an interesting point, because we saw that with Baltimore, right? With a popular quarterback in Lamar, we saw receivers didn't want to go there because of the style they play. That's fair. I don't think it's a certainty, though. And Cleveland's also got a lot going for it, Nick. Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, great aquarium down there, the flats. The flats are still open. Guys love Cleveland. Trust me. Trust me. Guys love it.